Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Your glance at sex, society, and culture.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome to the 8th episode of the Peep Show podcast. Before we begin, we wanted to let you all know that we will be in Las Vegas covering AVN this week, so please make sure to follow us on Twitter at peep_cast and Instagram at peepshow_podcast for live updates and other fun stuff. But for this episode, we are really excited to bring to you two wonderful guests. We will be talking to Professor Julian Gill-Peterson about his upcoming book, Histories of the Transgender Child, and to Cam4 cam coach and all-around cam girl guru, Niki Knight. But first, a glance at the news. OK Cupid recently announced that they have changed their policy from allowing people to use screen names on their profiles to pushing real first names. There has been an intense outcry about this from many communities, most notably from the LGBTQ community, who have pointed out that using real names in connection with dating interests puts them at risk. This is particularly troubling given that historically, OK Cupid has been the most queer-friendly dating platform. They were the first to allow folks to identify as non-binary, and they allowed for a wide range of sexual orientations and gender identities. One of the reasons that OK Cupid has given for this change is that they believe people will be more authentic if they use their real names. As a member of a community where I know very few people's real names, and yet do in fact have real relationships, I find this rather odd.
In a piece for Gizmodo titled, OK Cupid's New Real Name Policy is Dumb, journalist Kate Conger reports that the company has backpedaled a bit, saying in a tweet, quote, "You do not need to use your government name or even your full first name. Use the name, nickname, or initials you'd like your date to call you on OK Cupid," end quote. The company further explains a name will be considered valid as long as it is 2 letters long and does not contain numbers, symbols, or emojis. There is also a list of banned words you cannot use. An OK Cupid spokesperson explained, "We encourage users who do not feel comfortable to use a nickname or their initials." So it does seem that OK Cupid is trying to make some concessions here, but I agree with you that the underlying premise of this decision that people behave in a way that's somehow more real or more authentic if they associate their profiles with a real name or a name that they use in other contexts is pretty problematic.
Yeah, intuitively, it doesn't even seem right to me. I think that there's a certain freedom in using a pseudonym that allows you to maybe represent yourself in ways or your interest in ways that you wouldn't necessarily do if the things that you say is going to be pushed back to people outside of the context of that dating website.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, OK Cupid, they made clear in this article they don't index your profile on Google, but
that's new though, actually.
Yeah.
They just stopped indexing it.
But still, it's not going to be super hard for somebody who's trying to find you if you have a real name or name that you commonly use listed on the site. I mean, I think what's particularly concerning here is that they ask for a ton of personal information.
Yeah, more than other websites.
Yeah, far more than other dating websites like Tinder or Bumble or whatever.
Sure. Political affiliations and drug history and sexual preferences and practices. And
I mean, part of it is that there are those like user-generated questions that allow for like a really, really wide range of information to be shared. So you have a ton of information then on their site, but if you're using your real name or a nickname that you commonly use, then it's going to be really easy for someone in your area to come along and search for you on the platform and to dig up that information. And my sense is that's going to make users actually far less comfortable.
Yeah, that's my thought too, is if I have to use my real first name or a nickname of my real first name, then I'm going to be far less likely to answer those questions totally truthfully. And I mean, on a personal note, you and I met on OK Cupid, and part of the reason that we met is because we were so algorithmically matched. And I don't know that those sorts of things would have happened if you aren't comfortable answering all of those questions.
Right. And I mean, that is what distinguishes OkCupid from other sites. This is, in fact, an iteration of the longstanding quote-unquote NIM wars on the internet. Back in the 90s, it was far more common practice for people to use a variety of pseudonyms on platforms. Google and Facebook came along and changed that and really encouraged the use of real names, kind of suggesting that it would foster accountability. And to some degree, that probably is true.
When you're talking about trolling or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's quite possible that people might, be less likely to troll. People, in particular women, might feel safer in the sense that it feels more like you're talking to, a real person that you have some identifiable information about.
Sure.
Of course, that could just be, made up.
Right. Well, yeah, but that actually points to another thing that I find really strange about this is what are they actually trying to accomplish with this? It seems to me like one of the things that they're trying to accomplish is conformity with the other platforms and norms of the other platforms like Tinder and Bumble. And if now they're backpedaling and saying, we actually don't care if you use your legal name, you can use a nickname, you can use initials, it actually doesn't even have any meaning.
I think there's maybe two possible reasons why they might want to do this. One is kind of straightforward. Bumble just announced that they're doing Instagram integration. Tinder has done Instagram integration for a long time. It may be the case that if OkCupid wants to integrate with sites like Facebook, they might need to have this real name policy in place first.
Yeah.
So that they don't get accused.
Which that's a terrible idea.
Yeah. Oh,
I hate that.
Exactly.
That seems completely problematic to me because it seems like what all of these sites seem to believe is that we all want all of our social networks to be collapsed into a single network that includes everyone we know and in every context that we know them. And I can see so many reasons for so many different people of different communities that wouldn't want that to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think any of us really would want our parents to have access to our dating profiles,
sure,
or our kids, or
right,
among all sorts of other issues you could imagine. But that seems to be the most immediate, and that's probably particularly acute for queer kids or trans kids, or right. But the other reason I think that might motivate them in doing this is that it creates a sort of illusion of safety or security for users and maybe makes them feel like they know about the person on the other end of the profile or have some information, when in point of fact, it's not actually doing anything concrete to make these interactions more secure. I mean, it's not like they're verifying driver's licenses or anything, but maybe it creates an illusion of safety or security that they think is important or valuable in attracting users.
I think that in practice, they should not be doing this.
Yeah.
That's the takeaway I have. We're here today with Julian Gill-Peterson, who's going to talk to us about his current research. He's an assistant professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh with a secondary appointment in gender, sexuality, and women's studies. He holds a PhD in American Studies from Rutgers University. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to chatting.
Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited to have you on today. Can you give us kind of a broad overview of the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I'm just sort of coming to the end of a book project that, at its broadest, really is sort of a history of transgender children in the United States. I've sort of worked through the medical archive of trans medicine over the course of the 20th century to try and uncover the sorts of experiences, identities, and medical discourses that took hold of trans children from really the opening of the 20th century till about 1980.
A trans son, and this is something we think about a lot, but to be perfectly honest, I'm like totally unaware of this history.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that as you were talking too, because I remember, when our son came out and when I went to his middle school to advocate for him there, him being the first trans student that ever was out at the school, there is kind of this sense that you get with this generation that like this is something new and people are just learning how to deal with it. And I feel like they've rapidly learned to deal with it, like very quickly, but still with this idea that this is something that's new that we all have to learn, and not having a sense that there's a very long history that preceded this.
It's a fascinating issue. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I myself stumbled into the work not expecting there to be such a long and rich history. It was really through a kind of trial and error in archives that had been marked as trans history archives because of previous historians, especially work with medical records. But, it's maybe on the one hand not surprising, right, that trans people's history in general has been very much erased, where they're actively erased, by trans exclusionary forces or, through forms of invisibility, because the identities and categories and taxonomies we have today are really quite different than the ones that circulated 30, 40, 50, 60, and then especially 70, 80, 90 years ago.
Yeah.
So part of it is also kind of confronting how different some of these categories like trans, gender, and childhood look when we put them in a different historical context. So the surprises sort of this history, I think, kind of go on and on and on.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. One of the things when I was looking over your project that you're working on is you were talking a little bit about the history and how this went along in the 20th century, but also you mentioned that the construction of the idea of gender only came about in the mid-50s, and that was actually really shocking to me. Shocking because I actually used to teach women in gender studies and feminist philosophy, and I spent so much time with my students talking about the difference between sex and gender without ever considering that was a relatively new concept. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I'm not the only person that's sort of revisiting where does gender itself come from? And in that sense, gender really, really, really specifically, the word gender in the English language, in the context that we understand it today, where it has to do with someone's sense of their self, how they present themselves to the world. And now we sort of use the term gender identity. That didn't even quite come about maybe until the 60s or the 70s. But it's been a fascinating, I used to teach this way too. Gender is something that feminists brought into the conversation, which is true. But interestingly enough, the distinction between sex and gender in the way we have it today was coined by psychiatrists in the 60s. And even actually 70s feminists take that distinction from psychiatry, except they completely rework the context.
Well, yeah, we were talking about that today because when we were talking about this, I was saying, yes, but I read A Second Sex where Simone de Beauvoir starts and she says, one is not born but made a woman. And I think we anachronistically read that to mean that she's making this distinction between sex and gender. And when she's saying, you're not born a woman, but you're made one.
Even though she's not specifically using that language of gender, we sort of... I do think we start a lot of those conversations with Simone de Beauvoir.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, the interesting sort of distinction then with the kind of history I wanted to talk about, prior to the emergence of gender as a category that was being used first in medicine and psychology, the term sex was supposed to encompass everything. And so by about 1950, I mean, sex is just this ridiculous category in biology and in medicine. It means so many different things, right? It means a certain fledgling sense of chromosomes were coming into being. It meant especially hormones and the endocrine system mostly. But it also meant psychology and one's sense of self and how they present themselves in the world. And gender really, I argue, a couple of things. One, it was really created out of experiments on children's bodies.
Wow.
And it's
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's this really mostly gruesome history at Johns Hopkins Hospital in particular in Baltimore. And John Money, who's a pretty well-known sexologist, psychologist, was in charge of the medical program for intersex children at the hospital. And then as well, trans children and adults. And Money really is the person who famously created this theory that social gender a child is raised in, they're more or less going to come to identify with, as long as there's nothing that would contradict that.
So very life. Like constructionist.
Kind of extreme, like to the extreme, right?
Yeah.
So Money was really in favor of genital surgeries on intersex children to create the most normative possible looking body.
I see.
And then argued that, if parents simply raise their children as whichever sex the doctor decided was the most reasonably, manufactured sex, then that would all work out, and their gender identity would grow out of this sort of really... So Money basically calls gender identity the same as your first language, that there's this sort of developmentally sensitive moment that he changes the age constantly. But, let's say before age 1.5, right, where you can kind of be programmed with this cultural social information that tells you who you are, that then takes on a kind of ineradicable biological reality. And famously, Money turns out to be, completely wrong. I mean, many of the children that he elects and chooses a sex for when they're infants or very young children without any input don't grow up to feel themselves to be the gender that he had assigned. So gender really in this context was a kind of medical
reading
device.
That a lot of the... Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I remember reading some of these stories and most of those kids weren't even told that any of this happened, right?
No. It's a really, it's a brutal chapter in medical ethics and medical history, although one that, especially in the case of intersex medicine, has changed much less than we might think. Actually, really in contradistinction to trans medicine, which has radically changed over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
But the reason that I talk about intersex children in this book about trans childhood, right, is for two reasons. One, the invention of gender becomes so important, right? So the idea that you form a gender identity by a certain age becomes basically the motivating factor of trans medicine in the post-war era. The idea of binary transition, that you have to transition from one recognizable gender to the other,
right,
really didn't make a lot of sense until you had that category, right?
Oh,
but the other interesting other interesting flip side is, prior to the invention of gender as a category, intersex, that category, and the sorts of meanings that circulated around it were actually a very important way that a lot of trans people explained and accounted for themselves to doctors.
Okay.
And that's because American doctors famously were very, very slow and reluctant to offer trans people medical care of any kind. So, we know a lot more now about particularly like Germany in the 1920s, where you had Magnus Hirschfeld and other sexologists and doctors providing different forms of transition to trans people in that, especially in Berlin, even prior to the availability of hormones. But American doctors never wanted to do that. They constantly would shut down any attempts of trans people to access care. And so intersex became...
How long have hormones been available? I guess longer than most people
would think. They were definitely not very reliable early on. It took a long time to be able to synthesize them artificially. So early on, what you would do is... Actually, people would harvest hormones from animals and from whether...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, internal tissues. And you could sort of create these preparations that people would get injected with. To be honest, they didn't really do very much. They're extremely diluted in quality, or just variable, right, in quality. But synthetic hormones really come into existence in the 1930s, and then especially during the war in the 40s.
Wow.
So testosterone, estrogen, the ones that we're most familiar with, but a whole host of other ones really start to become available in the late 1930s. Definitely in the 40s and the 50s is this big heyday. So you really see actually the idea of gender is like the psychological idea, right? But it's actually very much underwritten in these big hospitals by the science of hormones, and a lot of pretty unethical experimentation. And of course, children who don't have the ability to consent to medical treatment sometimes can't understand what's going on, or don't even speak yet. In the case of infants, really were the primary bodies that were being experimented on for really about 30 or 40 years.
Who were these children? I mean, like, was it parents that were bringing the kids to these hospitals, and what was the motivation for that?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, right? I mean, the story of the intersex children that come to hospitals like Hopkins, right, is pretty distinct from the stories of trans children. And despite what I just said, that, you know, trans folks would often use intersex language to present themselves, there really wasn't an overlap amongst the children. So there weren't a bunch of trans children being diagnosed as intersex. In fact, doctors would just ignore most people who tried to claim they were intersex. And in any case, children didn't seem to be doing that in that time period. But in terms of intersex children, it depends. You know, Hopkins got this reputation for being a place where anyone who was categorized as abnormal in their sexuality could go to be seen. And so it depends, you know, in a lot of cases, it seems that intersex children really grew up with a wide degree of tolerance and affirmation from their families. And sometimes it wasn't until puberty and changes in the physical body creating a more difficult situation to live as whatever social identity they had chosen, and whatever gender identity, to use an anachronistic term, they had chosen, right? Kind of came into question. And that was often the prompt. And then sometimes parents' anxieties and inability to know what to do, right, would bring them in. But it's really in the 50s when you have this invention of gender that a lot more anxiety gets placed on children's gender identity and on their bodies. So if before there was a little bit more variability, right? And also doctors just didn't, you know, have as much prestige in the United States. By the 50s, there's really this kind of impulse that the sex of a baby at birth is very important because their gender identity depends on it. And money really argues that if that's not all straightened out in the most extreme literal sense, then it will create some sort of crisis because it's abnormal.
Isn't this around the same time that toy manufacturers were? I mean, this is maybe like a far afield, but it seems like in the histories that I've heard of like children's toys too, that there became around the 50s like a pretty intense like gendering of toys that didn't exist prior to that. But it seems like there's maybe a collective anxiety at this time.
Absolutely.
That is manifested in a lot of different ways of raising children.
Absolutely, right. And the way that children become, in quite a literal sense, poster childs in the Cold War as well for the sorts of capitalist, heteronormative values that the United States wants to project onto the world at the same time that communism is being associated with, you know, homosexuality or effeminacy in men, right? So there is this sort of kind of cisgender heteronormative project in the 50s. And I think you can absolutely read the invention of gender really as a sort of medical side of that. And it's all about the kind of really the sort of white innocent child in whose name this massive state apparatus and medical apparatus is going to come into formation, you know, and really take charge of how people, play with toys, you know. Toys were at the heart of the therapy that these kinds of doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists were using in this time period.
Yeah, a quick Google search tells me that Barbie was invented in 1959.
Yes.
So it's
really interesting.
Yeah, you know, it seems like that's more than a coincidence that you would have, you know, sort of the iconic, you know, sort of feminine gendered toy emerging at that, you know, simultaneously with this crystallizing of this idea of gender as a concept.
Right.
Well, and part of what that tells us, right, is that it's one of the sort of most problematic effects of medicalizing gender and medicalizing sex, medicalizing trans people, because interestingly enough, and it was very hard to find archival historical evidence of what trans childhood was like, say, in the 1920s or 30s. Yeah. But I did find some, right? And what was quite interesting there, and the only reason I know this is because much, much later on in their lives, these folks did end up going to see doctors, maybe in the 50s or the 60s. Yeah. But by then, it's not because they didn't realize they were trans until they were adults. They had already lived out and openly since often the age of 12, 13, 14. Yeah. With the complete acceptance of their families and local communities. And I'm talking about including rural states in the deep South, in the Midwest. Wow. But the reason why counterintuitively that actually makes a lot of sense is because there wasn't a pervasive medical discourse saying that everyone needed to be cisgendered in a certain way. And so in that sense, the social reality of a trans boy being a boy or a trans girl being a girl in an interesting way had a little bit more capacious, you know, breathing room than it would come to in the post-war era. And that's one of the reasons why in my work I try to look before the 1950s and after, because what came after the 50s has really dominated our imagination about what being transgender means. And that's just a very, very narrow medical concept that actually really erases a lot of what has happened since the 50s and has happening today. But also, especially if you go back before that time period, you see the sort of truth that trans people don't need medicine to know who they are, right? And that they have lived, beyond the medical model and continue to live beyond the medical model, in ways that those medical discourses do not acknowledge.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've read a lot of narratives of trans people who have said that they actually had to teach themselves to talk about their identity in a way that the medical establishment would then take it seriously, even if it was kind of a construction and kind of a fiction. So for example, telling stories about I knew since I was 5 years old, when maybe that's not particularly true, or it's an overstatement.
In some ways, the highest stakes are for trans children because of a sort of much longer standing and much broader discourse of child development that, it's really hard to think of children without thinking about them developmentally. I mean, it's almost impossible because we understand children to be emblems of development, unfinished. We expect that we can learn where gender comes from or where transgender comes from just by watching trans children or studying them. And the problem with that, of course, is that it really interferes with recognizing who they say they are and what they already know about themselves.
Yeah.
And this is a problem that I try to trace back really over a whole century, where instead of listening to trans children's own knowledge about themselves, their own desires, how they talk about who they are, and just taking their gender identities seriously, doctors have only been interested in studying them to try and explain something else, right? Where everyone's gender comes from, or where trans people's sense of self comes from. And that can have, both in theory, affirmative, maybe implications, but it's often had really terrible implications that if we could find an etiology for how transgender people develop, then we could try to prevent their development, right? I mean, that was a huge, huge industry in the 60s. And so, one of the big takeaways for me from this research is that the sort of special burden that trans children bear is that they're supposed to be an explanation for trans people in general.
Yeah, because they're searching for an acceptable explanation or definition of who they say that they are. And cis people are never asked to account for their own identity like that.
How far back does your research go? I mean, I'm thinking in the early 1900s, right? Like Freud and at the very beginning of psychoanalysis, there was certainly a lot of discussion of childhood development in a way that was very sexed, I guess. I'm just kind of curious, do you reach back that far?
Yeah, that's actually precisely where I pick up and for some of those reasons, right? I mean, so, one of the things that we take for granted today that's just actually incredibly surprisingly historically recent is the separation of sex from gender and sexuality, right? That actually for most of the past century, those distinctions don't really make a lot of sense. And so Freud, for instance, is very much interested in what then was called inversion, right? Inversion, which is interestingly that, the sort of classic definition of inversion is a woman's soul trapped in a man's body or a man's brain trapped in a woman's body, which sounds eerily similar to one dominant narrative that circulates around trans experience, though certainly it's not a representative narrative. And at that time, inversion might have meant what we would today think of as a gay or lesbian person, or it might have meant what today we would think of as a trans person. And it's really interesting that that is so different, right? It's actually really anathema to some of the sort of identity politics that, being litigated today or have been litigated as border wars or, or trans exclusionary feminism, etc.
Yeah.
But what sort of unifies that moment and makes it important to me is actually just about the way that development and sex were understood in general. And there was this sort of broad agreement by science that no one was really a man or a woman, but that in reality, every organism was really just sort of a mix of masculinity and femininity, and typically one was predominant. And so that would be the sex that you would ascribe, but that every animal and every person carry latently the other sex within them. And so that really creates a pretty different landscape. So when it comes to very early hormones and surgeries, right, the actual justification was in some interesting ways almost easier to make, because if you take it to be scientifically true that no one is really a binary sex, then it's not so remarkable that you might want to change parts of how your body is seen by the world, right?
It's almost then like much more of a continuum, and you want to just move to one side or the other.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
So,
and we've really lost that sense. But on the flip side, the downside to that way of thinking, that was sort of a discourse that was called natural bisexuality, and Freud uses that phrase.
Sure.
But it's a very different sense than what bisexuality means today.
Right.
Yeah.
But within that is this kind of sense that sex is plastic, right? So plasticity, the plasticity of the body and the mind, is sort of the central feature to the way that psychoanalysis and then endocrinology and psychiatry take hold of the body, because they all come to think of the body as something that is not rigid and static, but can be actually changed over time and naturally changes as it grows. And that's why children actually become the most important objects of research, because children are framed
as more plastic.
as the most plastic, in fact.
Yeah.
So for that reason, it becomes a lot easier to locate trans folks and children in that time period through that lens of plasticity. Interestingly, these are not new concepts. However, they have a pretty disturbing history in and of themselves, in that early 20th century moment, they were explicitly eugenic and racist scientific projects.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so this sort of sense of plasticity, right? The sense of malleability, openness to change and to taking on different forms, right? What ends up happening is that concept gets racialized as a sort of property that belongs to white bodies in the greatest abundance.
Wow.
So people of color, but especially African Americans in the United States, are basically racialized as less plastic. And this goes way beyond hormones, way beyond trans medicine. Trans medicine is not the place that this idea comes about. It's just affected by it.
Yeah.
And that's the only way to kind of try and manage that paradox. And, to be honest, it doesn't resolve it, right? So it just creates constant problems of exclusion.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening in the 1960s is, as more and more white trans children are being diagnosed and increasingly allowed into clinics and are getting much more access to hormones in particular than they'd ever had before, you see a huge differentiation, and Black trans children in particular are being willfully misdiagnosed as schizophrenic or even as like clinical homosexuals, which is to say just a total rejection of what they're saying about themselves, how they're presenting themselves, in order to completely reject them from this new medical model. The implicit idea is that there's something about Black bodies that is not plastic enough to be worthy of medical care. It gives us a different set of coordinates to think about this new renewed excitement, right, in plasticity today, right? Who is considered plastic? Right. Whose brain, whose fluidity, right? And who is allowed to be seen as fluid? I think it's exciting. I mean, I'm very excited that is.
What do you make
happening.
of the disparity in violence against trans people? Because it seems to me, just from reading the looking at the stories and reading the news, that trans people of color are targeted at much higher rates. I mean, do you think that that's connected to?
Definitely, right? I mean, there are a couple intersecting histories here, right? I mean, but it's true that the rate of violence against Black trans women and Latina trans women is probably the single highest vector of violence experienced by any group of people,
right?
In the United States. And it seems to me that, there are other histories of racism and misogyny that are very, very long and very old that are coming into play. If anything, maybe they get intensified, right, by the way the medical model also has a racial logic baked into it. Yeah. So Black trans women and Latina trans women have had to fight harder to justify themselves, right? Yeah. Even within, famously coming out of Stonewall, even with gay and lesbian activists, right? They were the most dismissed immediately.
Yeah.
And so some of that is anti-Blackness, some of that is institutional racism.
Yeah.
It seems to me what happens is the intersection there, right? With some of these other racial logics of gender sort of maybe intensify or increase that structural vulnerability.
I'm also curious about how this is tied into particularly like the hypersexualization of both Black men and women in different ways. Like with Black men, I think it often manifests as like anxiety that becomes very evident in all of the interest in race play that exists within sex work. That there is clearly a lot of anxiety on the part of white men who overwhelmingly in this country are, the people who have the money and interest in paying for sex work. There is a lot of anxiety when it comes to Black men and their supposed virileness and penis size and these other things. And on the other end, there's a hypersexualization of Black women as well. And I wonder if that isn't in some way tied to, this notion that you're talking about from a century ago, where we kind of pushed Black people out into either end of the binary, claiming that they were less plastic and therefore they would have to be more binarized or whatever what's the word for that? I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of reductionist right framework. No, I think you're right about that. It's something that folks particularly in Black trans studies, which is a sort of burgeoning field, have named, for example, as the problem, right, is that hypervisibility, we tend to think visibility brings progress, but visibility can also, ironically, bring a charge of non-existence or social death or no value to someone's personhood, total denial of personhood. Right. And that really is what we're seeing, right? We tend to celebrate the rise in trans visibility that we've seen over the last 10 years, but for Black trans women and Latinx trans people, right? I mean, that for trans people of color in general, that rise in visibility has, it seems, at least correlated to, if not had some sort of causal relationship to an increase in violence and vulnerability to violence.
Yeah.
This was all really interesting. Is there any other things that you think that we should take away?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of basic point that I want to make in bringing this book out into the world is really just to insist that trans children have a history, right? Clearly it's embedded in these much bigger discussions that we've been having. But I think, for me, my motivation, at least, is that I think it really matters to be able, in the midst of all the different ways that trans children are being used as pawns in political struggles, have to fight just to be recognized at school or, in gender segregated associations, to get access to healthcare, which is still a huge barrier, that it really makes a difference to be able to stand up in the public and point to a history, right? And so much of what is passing for common sense knowledge right now about trans kids, even from very inclusive progressive voices, it really seems to just double down on this idea that this is all brand new. We don't know what's really happening. So therefore we can really scrutinize the choices that trans kids and their families make. Yeah. When really I would want to say to that, no, this isn't new. We have a long and rich history. Trans children have been very dynamic players even in the construction of this medical discourse that tries to silence them. And so I think that
was actually in part my motivation for asking about the history of hormones. My child is on hormones, but that was a very long process. I don't know, when we were going through this, the message that we were getting was, we don't actually know. There's not a history of kids this young starting hormones. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so I feel like we almost felt like we were making those decisions in a vacuum.
Yes. Yeah.
And nobody told us that actually you're not making it in a vacuum. There actually is people throughout the history of the last 100 years who've gone through these sorts of things. And that's interesting.
Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference, right? I mean, I can only speak as a sort of historian, but of course, Those doctors, I mean, I believe that they sincerely say that, right?
Right.
But it's totally facetious, right?
Yeah.
There's a long history. But of course...
Yeah, I didn't get the sense that they, thought they were deceiving us. They just said, we don't know.
For them,
this is new for us.
But for them, they need
whatever their
longitudinal
scope.
studies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
When they say that, what they mean is this exact formulation of hormones that was studied through this exact methodological process, because that's the only knowledge that, within a medical context is considered valid. And so thus all other, kinds of knowledge, all other information is simply bracketed out of those conversations.
Yeah.
And,
But as parents, like when we were going through that, there was a sense in which, we thought, well, we have to make a decision based on something else besides like medicine that it's a social decision. It's something about identity.
It's also just something about situated knowledge and believing your kid's story and just having faith in somebody's own reported experience,
right?
Which is such a better source. I mean, to be perfectly honest, right? That's my biggest frustration is that, and particularly the way that the model of binary transition has only become more and more central, right, to trans medicine over the last 20-30 years. It's extremely central to the way that, despite this sort of generally accepted idea that children are sort of a little gender fluid anyways, there's still this sense that, especially around, puberty blockers and then other hormone therapies, that it's some sort of threshold that once crossed can never be taken back. And that's just such a poor reading of what the human body is and what gender is, right? And that we think, but again, it's that sort of idea at the bottom that at the end of childhood, that gender is sorted out, right? And that's just, it's outrageous. That's not true for cis people. It's not true that you get to adulthood and you never again think about your gender, right? Whatever your gender may be. It's not, it's not true for trans folks either. So I think that's a really unfortunate consequence of where the discourse has gotten to, there are some longitudinal studies now, thankfully. But the sort of basic notion that gender needs to be settled by the time, let's say, at least puberty is over, I think is really unfortunate. And also, interestingly, not consistent with the history of the last 100 years.
So for people who are interested in your work, where could they find your book? When is that coming out?
Yeah, so academia moves slowly, and I can promise that the book will be out in the world probably in the fall of 2018. So still a little ways away. But for folks who are interested, I'm on Twitter at GP Julian Julian, and if you Google me, you'll find my academic coordinates at the University of Pittsburgh, where there's more information about some of the other work that I've published in this area so far.
Great.
Yeah.
So that sounds great. Yeah, nice. And we'll certainly tweet and
link to all of that.
Yep, and link to this podcast when your book comes out as well. So thanks for joining us. We really appreciated having you here and having this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been wonderful having a chance to talk.
Niki Knight is the head coach for Cam4.com and all-around camgirl guru. She wrote and developed the performer training area on Cam4 and has filled it with training articles, videos, and experience as a performer herself. Niki has been featured in Forbes, Cosmopolitan, and the show Real Future that is hosted on Fusion Network. You can join her free live coaching every Wednesday on cam4.com/cam4coach_en. So thanks, Niki, for coming and talking to us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We totally remember meeting you both at XBiz in Miami and then also at Exotica in Chicago. So we've been, looking for a reason to talk to you again. So we're glad you're here. You are a cam girl coach, and I think you're one of the first ones or the first one. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Of course. I would love to say that I'm the first, but I am not. Cam4 is actually, they're the first company to really bring coaching to the industry. It was actually the French team. They were really the first ones that started coaching, and it was a group of guys, and it wasn't like my coaching now. Like, it wasn't like live coaching sessions. They started doing it, and they would coach some performers to then like do a live coaching show. But they were mostly behind the scenes, and they would talk in chat, and they were really available to the performers. And like when I say built a relationship with them and built a team with them, and just that whole region just blossomed. And because of that success, Cam4 looked at it and was like, well, we need to expand on this. Like we really need to capitalize on this.
Yeah.
I honestly feel like it's out of a fairy tale that I just happened to get this opportunity, because it really did fall in my lap.
Yeah. What happened? How did you end up doing that?
I feel so bad when some people are like, well, how did you start to do this? I would like this as a career path. I almost feel like such a jerk. My sister was a bartender, and the HR woman's husband was a regular at my sister's bar. And Cam4 was looking for a head coach for a year or so. Anyways, this gentleman, the HR lady of Cam4's husband, asked my sister if she'd be interested, because she's very personable, she's an actress, and, you know, she was his favorite bartender. And she's like, you know what, you need to talk to my sister. And she kind of hooked it up. I mean, before camming, I've been a makeup artist for 15 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
camming is so dear to me, because at a point in my life when I wanted the flexibility and I needed a change in my life, it afforded me that, so I could do my art, I could do my makeup. And then I embarked on this amazing camming, and it was just such a blessing in my life. So as a makeup artist, I was a teacher and a trainer, a brand representative. I wrote makeup curriculums. So I had that experience.
Yeah.
And then I had the experience of being a webcam model for about 3 years at the time. My entire everything had been leading up to kind of this moment, and it just felt like such a perfect fit. And it's kind of fairy tale like. So
Yeah, I mean, that sounds really coincidental. So they approached your sister, and then turns out that you'd already been working in the industry for 3 years?
Basically, yeah. And I mean, I had so much experience as a teacher already.
Yeah.
They just went hand in hand. And I remember my sister, she messaged me. She's like, I have a job opportunity for you, but I don't know if I want to tell you. It's porn. And I was like, I literally got offline naked to take this call. Like, I'm literally holding it. What the fuck is your problem? Like, it's fine. And she's like, well, you know, what if it's human trafficking and blah, blah. I'm like, okay, no. And
she didn't know that you were camming?
She knew that I was camming, but she's still my sister, and like,
right.
She didn't fully understand, you know, it would be like some big company, because she knew that I was camming, but she knew that as all cam models have this wonderful safety, that I was at my home. No one knew where I was. And all of a sudden it was this big company that she and then I was like, well, come on, not everything can be fake. Turns out it was very real. So,
I like your reasoning. Not everything can be fake. It's not all a fraud. Something has to be true.
Well, something does, or else none of the fraud would work.
Right.
So
that's so true. It's very good logic. Yeah, that's a really interesting story. You know, I think about my own life, and I was talking to a cam friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about the same thing, how our past careers, even if they're not the same, have totally led us into doing the sort of work that we do and being able to do it well. Like, there's so many transferable skills.
I was just about to say that word, transferable skills.
Yeah.
Yes. You were the only other person who said that, because for my interview, I was like, these are my transferable skills, and this little sheet, and I was like, so business about it. I'm like, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But because camp is a job, like, it's not just about the sex. There's branding, there's marketing, there's promoting, there's video editing, there's networking. Like, just, there's so much to it that every other thing actually helps you out. Like, any experience you have doing anything really does help you out with this job.
I think you're right to say that it's not just about the sex, that there's all these other things, the marketing and the branding and all of that. But the thing that I've found to be the most interesting is that the sex isn't even all about the sex.
Yeah.
And I think that people from outside of the sex industry have a really hard time believing that.
Like the old thing, escorts say, oh yeah, no, most guys just pay me to listen to them talk. They just want to talk. And everyone's like, yeah, sure. It's actually the truth.
It's actually true. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. So, as a coach, then one of the things that you do have to talk, I'm assuming that what you talk to a lot of like future cam models or new cam models about is what sort of things like clients and customers are looking for in camming. So, what do you tell them?
I tell them this. People don't want to be sold to. People don't want something fake. People don't want something prepackaged or premeditated. They don't want something scripted. People are actually looking for that raw, vulnerable, like that sexual vulnerability. That's what they're really after. They're after that, like that piece of human experience that is undeniably real and honest. But you just don't get so many things today. Because of that, it actually doesn't even matter what you do. The more you try to please everyone in your room, the less you will succeed. Because that's like saying you go into a party or you make one kind of food. Like everyone has their own little thing that they're looking for. Everyone wants something different. You can't please everybody.
Right.
And the more you try, the less you will. So it doesn't actually matter what you're doing. It's that the viewers see how much you're enjoying doing it.
Yeah.
They want to see you lose yourself. They want to see, the mystery behind the curtains. They want to see something new. They want to experience your sexuality. They don't want you to cater to theirs or what you think they want, because that's boring.
Yeah.
And watching a performer try to please everyone in the room, that's not interesting.
Right.
So do things that you think are just the coolest. Like if you would watch it, if you would be your own fan, do it. The more unique, the more weird, the more you search inside yourself and just, are just honest with yourself and do just whatever. It doesn't even matter. The craziest, most unique things. That's what's going to make you a successful performer. And not only that, that's what's going to make you love being a performer. That's how you're going to get the most out of this job. I really hate to see someone sit there like all clothed, like, I'm not going to start my show until my room is full.
Yeah.
Or I'm not going to do anything until you pay me. Okay, like again, it's logical why you would think that, but put yourself in the shoes of a viewer. Just like you don't want to be frauded, neither do they. They work really hard for that money. And they are tipping you as a thank you. Like they don't owe you a damn thing. So build that trust relationship. Be online consistently. Talk to them. I found that really good fans, like you built like a cam friendship.
Yeah.
It's just really great viewers and the fans, and you love them. They're just so dear to you.
Sure.
They almost tip me for flashes, just like being cheeky, and then like, oh, they tip and be like, show me your boobs. Okay, no, show me your pussy. Okay, no, show me your ass. But it's almost like a really cheeky, fun kind of thing.
Yeah.
More than just using tips for flashes to make an overall show goal. And that's what you should be aiming for.
So what I hear you saying, and I think this is fairly interesting, I hadn't really thought about this much like this in relationship to camming, but the way in which a lot of people think about camming is that you're getting paid for particular things, and you think that we ought to reimagine what that payment is for. And it's not that they're paying you for a particular thing, but that they're showing you appreciation in some way. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah. Again, I hope you don't mind. I use a lot of analogies.
Sure.
I
like analogies.
Yes, I am a total teacher. Kind of liken it to the radio. You can turn on the radio is free, and you hear the biggest, most celebrated, richest celebrity singers in the world. And you can hear it all on for free. You can hear it on the internet, you can hear whatever. But the ones that you like, you're going to go to their concert. You're going to go buy their perfume. You're going to go get their t-shirt. You're back in the day when CDs were around, you go buy their CD. So the radio's free. Beyonce sings regardless if I turn the radio on or not.
Yeah.
But because I love her, like that is like, I want to go see her live. I want to go and be a fan of hers. I want to pay appreciation as a fan of hers and just show my love because I love what she does so much.
Yeah, so what you're suggesting then is that we ought to think about cam girls not as providing services, but as being performers.
I think so.
And that a performance-based model makes more sense.
Or at least like a menu of services, like a menu of like concrete sex acts or something, right?
Yeah, that's not how we ought to think about...
I don't want anyone to be like a body with a dildo.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want anyone to just be a naked body that's like, okay, you're like some kind of sex robot.
Right.
And I'm also not saying you should just do everything for free and hope that someone tips you. That's not what I'm saying either.
Yeah.
I'm saying express yourself. You have to cam for you, because if you are bored, everybody else is bored.
Yeah.
If you, it's just like anything in life, a singer, a painter, if you don't like the art, the craft that you are performing or doing, it's not going to be enticing. It's not going to be interesting, and no one's going to want to be a part of it, regardless of anything.
Yeah.
Even if it's technically great, even like you could be the hottest person in the world, but if your heart's not into it and you're just like, tip me if you want to see something, like that also that takes it to a dirty place almost.
Yeah.
And that's a dirty place for the viewers. Like, guys don't want to jerk off to a tragedy, you know, like they want to be a part of something fun.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
you need to cam for you, and you need to just be open and enjoy expressing this and enjoy performing and enjoy doing all these things. And yeah, of course you're going to enjoy making money, because that's also part of what makes it enjoyable. But the more fun you're having, it's like that old adage, do what you love and the money comes after, or the money will follow.
Right. Yeah.
It's the same thing. Like, the recipe hasn't changed.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're saying about thinking of cam performances as performances. But I wonder, what do you think motivates the viewers to tip in a model where they don't actually have to?
You know what? Personality. The money that is advertised like, oh, make $10 billion a day, blah, 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 that does happen. But that happens to models that work their asses off being themselves. Because it's actually scary to be yourself.
Yeah.
At first, because then all of a sudden you're looking in this mirror, and it's scary to get the answers to the questions. Am I sexy? Am I interested? Are they going to like me? Am I boring? I'm going to tell you, spoiler alert, you are sexy, you are interesting, you are fun, as long as you're being honest with yourself and honest in your performances.
Yeah.
And even if you're shy, oh my goodness, nervous performers are the most fun to watch, because you can't hide that. It's the most honest thing. So I think we need to stop thinking about watching sex. Yes, sex is always there. Like, that's just a no-brainer. People want to see, again, that vulnerability. They want to see that human element, because it is so powerful. It's scary to look in the mirror that first time.
Yeah.
But I'm guarantee you, the reason why every single cam performer, doesn't matter who they are, says camming is so empowering is because you've actually looked in that mirror and you've gotten those answers, and every single answer was positive.
Yeah, I really relate to what you're saying. I do more phone sex than I do camming, but speaking of transferable skills, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
What is your phone number?
But the thing that I think is really interesting and in line with what you're saying is that when I first started that, people would, when they asked me questions about whether I was like interested in what they were saying or not, you know, whatever their particular kink or whatever they were talking about, if that was interesting to me, I remember at the very beginning thinking, how does he want me to answer? It's like, you know, trying to anticipate what he wants. And then it struck me, you know, not even that long into it, 3 or 4 days into it, I don't actually know what they want. And so I can't anticipate what it is that they want. I can only speak from a very honest place from where I am. And I can only answer from the person that I am and from the experiences that I've had. And that was so much more successful than trying to give somebody what they want, particularly since I don't know these people I come to know them, but you start off as strangers. And so I think that everything that you're saying is right in terms of you have to be yourself and enjoy what you're doing. And people who are attracted to that will come to you. They'll be attracted to you as you are. And you can't just create like a persona that you think will be attractive to, you know, a particular group of people, because you can't anticipate that.
It's exhausting. You said something that was so perfect. Like, you need to get out of my head right now, because this is number 2 for you. And when someone
maybe
was
we're
asked,
like maybe we're one
maybe
person.
we should call each other, do a cam to cam.
Yeah.
What you're saying?
Yeah, maybe.
I'm picking up what you're.
That would be like awesome.
But no, you can stay. That's cool.
Ooh, it'd be even more fun. Okay.
So, I'm sorry. Old habits. So when you were saying, when you'd be talking to these gentlemen and they'd be asking you, are you interested in what I'm
suggesting?
Like what I like?
Yeah.
And that also rings so true for cam models because, again, those people haven't looked in the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And I remind cam models all the time that not everyone who comes in your room are masters of conversation, so don't demand it of them.
Yeah.
And when I give them options to find out what they want, instead of saying, oh, what do you want, baby? Like, what kind of show do you want? Number one, that puts them on the spot because of that insecurity. Because to them, a cam model, I don't care if it's your first day, you are the bravest person on earth to them. Like,
Yeah, interesting.
are on the internet, and they feel like anything that they say would be so lame and so boring, and then they would have to look in the mirror. Am I interesting? Am
Yeah.
And so that's what we end up doing to them. So why don't we just skip that whole thing and instead of saying that, just, and you could even use this for phone sex. I tell them when you go into a private show, you just say, hey, now that we're alone, what can I call you?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, that's what I do that naturally. Like, what words what do you want to be called? And you can find out so much about what somebody wants and how they think about something just by listening to the sorts of words that they use to talk about what they want.
Big time. Well, if they give you a username or don't say anything, that's just a come show and go. Like, that's what that is. If they give you a real name, that person's looking for a little bit more of a connection.
Yeah.
Then you can, of course, use their name. Oh, Jim, you're such a pervert. Do you like that, Jim? Jim. Right? It's just such an icebreaker. And then when they say...
it's usually people who, want to use their real names, too, who are really excited if you use them. They'll be like, oh, I'm so glad that you say Jeff over. Like, I want you to say... They want you to know that you know who they are.
Yeah. Because, again, it's that connection.
Mm-hmm.
It's that someone, like, I feel special. I feel like I'm part of something. And just as a side note, to be perfectly honest, I don't want the tabooness of porn to ever end. I always want it to be there because as soon as we get rid of it, guess what? Boundaries are pushed and then we all just become more disgusting. Like half of the titillation of it is that it is something naughty. It is something bad. I don't agree with like horrific slut shaming.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what you were suggesting is that there has to be some sort of boundaries around it for it to be successful, for people to want to participate in it, because it does seem a little bit naughty, but that can't extend to shaming the performers or the people who work within the industry.
If anyone who spits on someone else for doing something brave or something that you yourself could not do can suck my butt.
That's going to be the pull quote for
yeah.
for your interview.
Right? If you don't have the balls to do it yourself, just, I don't know, get a hobby or something.
Yeah, just let other people who do have that do their thing.
Yeah, just tip me.
Yeah.
There you go.
Related to that idea of asking people what their name is, I know you've talked about, too, how you often will go on fantasy dates before you have fantasy sex, which seemed really similar to me, and how...
I always ask what we're eating. Like, what are we going to eat on our dinner? Because I feel like if they say we're going to have filet mignon and red wine, that's going to create a totally different date atmosphere than if they say they want to have like buffalo wings and beer, right? And buffalo wings and beer are fun sometimes, and filet and wine is fun sometimes, but they're asking for something different, I think.
That's amazing. I'm actually going to write that down. That's a very good question.
I mean, that's interesting because I think the point you're making that like people are so craving that kind of social connection that's a major thing that cam models are providing.
God's work.
Yeah. Within those shows, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's also interesting because it's also creating a situation, and we have, I think, very few of these situations in our society where sex can be social as well.
Yeah.
I agree.
When I did cam, one of the things that I thought was super interesting about camming was the way that men actually developed like camaraderies in the rooms.
100%.
And would talk about like, oh, look at what's going on. Isn't that cool? Oh, she's really beautiful. And like having conversations with each other to the point that sometimes I was like, they could just like go on. I don't actually have to do anything. This is about them chatting with each other and
talking about their wife or ex-wife or whatever.
Whatever, yeah.
Absolutely. because it makes them so comfortable in their own skin.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's almost as if like cam rooms are like safe spaces for men to interact, but because there's sort of a cam model, generally a woman there mediating those interactions,
Makes it okay.
they can put some of their guard down.
We're so just naturally drawn to each other, and we're so open about our sexuality.
Yeah, it's so easy to talk to other women about our intimate lives.
Absolutely, and it's that female intimacy is just kind of a given, as where with men it's not. But camming just lets them explore it in a safe place.
I was going to say that I think patriarchy and toxic masculinity is really traumatic for men, like in a different way than it's traumatic for women, but it's also very traumatic for men. And it seems to me like one of the things that happens in these spaces is that men can kind of work out some of their anxiety that they have about other men.
I mean, as a female, I can only say so much.
Yeah.
But I absolutely, I agree from what I see. That whole homophobia is like, it's just kind of not there. And you do see it sometimes. Some male performers will come on and be like, I only want to perform for women. And I ask them, I'm like, is money gay? They're like, well, no. I'm like, do you really care?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, and I'm like, you know what? And that's fine if you do, because then I don't think that this is a job for you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's just not a critical mass of female viewers it's going to sustain.
See, I think women are definitely becoming more of the viewer population, but just, I don't know if women really seek out that kind of entertainment, just because a lot of pornography is horrible to watch. I mean, there's a lot of it that's awesome to watch, but it's just not something. Women are very sexualized anyway, that I don't think they seek out that much.
Yeah.
So, Nikki, where can people find you?
Well, people can stalk me. You can always find me on social media. You can find me on Twitter at Nikki, Nikki _NIGHT. On Instagram, I'm Nikki.cam4. You can also come and find me on Cam4. My coaching URL is Cam4Coach, like CAM, the number 4, coach _EN, and EN is for the English language. I actually have coaching 7 different languages, and I have male-specific coaches. Can get out to everybody.
Yeah, that's awesome. You have a little empire.
But sometimes it's not about the information. Sometimes people are just more receptive, based like depending on where the information's coming from. So we have male coaches, so we offer like just many different avenues that you can come and be a community with us and, get some pro tips. If you ever want to contact me and have questions, I'm sure I'm going to get a dick pic out of this. You can email me at nikki@cam4.com and KKI@cam4.com.
All right.
No dick unless they're huge.
Or there's money attached.
See?
A dick pic along with an Amazon gift card. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.
Okay, we did too. Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, Nikki.
We really enjoyed putting this episode together for you all. We appreciate the time and energy of our 2 wonderful guests, Julian Gill-Peterson and Niki Knight. You can find Julian on Twitter at GPJULIAN and Nikki on Twitter at Nikki_Knight. We are about to head to Las Vegas to cover AVN, so please make sure to look out for us on Twitter and Instagram for live coverage of events and other fun stuff. On Twitter, we are at peep_cast, and on Instagram, we are at peepshow_podcast. I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual.
I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me at Peach Sage.
We would like to remind you that we do have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. We need it to keep the podcast running, to pay for our website and services that host and distribute our podcast. Please consider visiting our Patreon and contributing. If only $1 a month, every little bit helps. Also, there are non-monetary ways that you can support us. If you listen on iTunes or SoundCloud, please leave us 5-star ratings and positive reviews. Thanks to Joe Kennedy for the music. The show was produced by Jesse and PJ Sage. Signing off, have a great week.